Chapter 29. Mazen. He had forgotten the relic in Ahmed's diwan. The weight of his guilt was so heavy it nearly knocked him off his feet as he burst out of the inn. It was all he could do to keep himself from sprinting outright towards the Wali's manor. Maybe if he moved quickly enough he could retrieve it before Aisha realized it was missing. He did not want her to think him more incompetent than he already was. Ahmed is fine. He's a hunter. There's no way he'd fall under a jinn's spell. Aisha had picked up the collar in the ruins without flinching after all. When Mazen had asked if the jinn tried to manipulate her, she'd scoffed and said, "I'm not gullible like you." Still, the closer he drew to Ahmed's residence, the more fearful he became. His dread became an anchor, pulling him back down into the dark waters of paranoia he'd been trying to surface from ever since his encounter with the Shadow Jinn. As he hurried through Dine's labyrinth-like streets, he became aware of the darkness twisting on the walls, of the shadows with red eyes, wrapped around the palm trees and draped across lantern-lit pathways. Gullible, Aisha had called him. How could his naivety be the cause of such morbid visions? Everywhere he turned he saw darkness encroaching. Inconsequential, it murmured in his ears. Mazen tried to convince himself that he was hallucinating, that his nightmares were bleeding into reality, but the shadows would not leave him alone. "You thought you could escape, but I know your blood." He was only streets away from the Wali's manor when a sudden nausea took hold of him and he was forced on shaking legs to make his way to the nearest alley so he could collapse against a wall. Sweat beaded his forehead and he could feel his heartbeat in the soles of his feet. And then the dark was pressing on him, clinging to his heels. "Jinn killer," it screamed, "you are not worthy of being my servant." "Not real," Mazen breathed out slowly. "Not real." He closed his eyes, but succeeded only in plunging himself into a different darkness, one illuminated by the mosaics of the 7 Jinn. The shadow with the red eyes grinned at him. Mazen turned away from the image only to face another, more haunting depiction. He saw the third, a woman holding a skull, the Queen of Dunes. In the buried ruins he hadn't been thinking of old Ruba's tale. It had not been until after that he connected the 2 Jinn. He hadn't brought up his suspicions to Aisha. She would think he was crazy. "I'm going to take my time with you, lest your suffering be over too quickly." Mazen pressed his hands to his ears, but the voices could not be blocked out. He dug his fingernails into his palms, and when the pain became too intense, he pushed them through the dirt instead. The ground creased beneath his touch. The feeling was so unexpected he opened his eyes and looked down, and he saw his shadow crinkled beneath his fingers like satin. He stared, pulled his hand away. The shadow flattened back into the ground like an ink stain. It did not attack him. It did not move. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for it again. When it rippled beneath his touch, he took a deep breath, then plucked it from the ground. The moment the shadow enveloped his hand, it disappeared from view. Gods, I really am going crazy. For a few minutes, all he could do was stare wearily at his hand, or lack of it. Then slowly, experimentally, he slipped other parts of his body through the shadow fabric. He watched in amazement as it all disappeared. His hand, his arm, his leg, anything beneath the pall of the shadow vanished. It was magic. It had to be. But where had it come from? He twisted the shadow in his hands and marveled at the way it faded in and out of existence. One moment it had the appearance of a deep black fabric, the next, it, and the skin beneath it, disappeared completely. My shadow is magic. The thought was so ridiculous he burst out laughing. A couple passing by the alley paused, and when Mazen looked up hurriedly, walked away. An idea occurred to him. He grabbed the shadow, and making sure the thing was covering every part of his body, stepped out of the alley. No passerby gave any sign of seeing him. Sometimes they glanced at the wall as if sensing his gaze, but never directly at him. He was a shadow. He was invisible. Mazen's mind whirred with questions long after he doffed the shadow and let it trail behind him. He wondered if this was a curse set on him by the shadow jinn. Maybe it was the reason she haunted his dreams. Or maybe, Mazen thought with a shudder, it was an omen.